Hi, everyone. My name is Alice Delage, and I'm a project manager at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, NCSA, and a member of the Women at NCSA organization group. And we are a group who leads monthly events, mostly focused on diversity and inclusion and women in the workplace, women in tech. And today we have the immense honor to welcome Bethany Anderson to speak to us today. Bethany Anderson is the Natural and Applied Science Archivist in the University of Illinois Archives. In this role, Bethany works with units across the University of Illinois campus to document the scientific enterprise. And she's especially interested in documenting women in science and technology, investigating archival functions in data management, and exploring computational approaches to digital archival materials. She's going to talk about contesting archival silences, women, technology, and creating inclusive archives. Bethany, please take it from there.
Thank you so much. I'm going to attempt to share my screen, so if you could just bear with me here for 1 second. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. It's really exciting to be participating in Women at NCSA. I'm Bethany Anderson, and I'm the Natural and Applied Sciences Archivist in the University Archives here at the University of Illinois. So today I'm going to talk about my work to document the history of computing at the university, and also talk about the importance of collecting and preserving an inclusive historical record of computing. And to that end, I will give a few examples from the university archives and discuss the work that still needs to be done. So first, just a bit about me, and thank you for that introduction, Alice. So despite my long title, I'm essentially an archivist for science, and my work entails documenting the interdisciplinary scientific enterprise at Illinois. And so I work with a few of the colleges on campus, including the College of Engineering, ACES, as well as units like the Prairie Research Institute and other science units and departments across the university to broadly capture and document the history of science and technology. The University Archives, where I work, is one of several special collections units which are part of the university library. And the Archives is unique in that it has a mandate from the university to serve as its official repository for records that have historical or permanent value. In addition to administrative records, we also collect personal archives of faculty and alumni and student organization records to ensure that we are capturing multiple perspectives on the university's history and not just top-down perspectives that reflect those of the university's administration. We have several programmatic areas in the archives that we focus our collecting on. So for example, one of my colleagues is the archivist for student life and culture. And so she focuses on collecting records that document student life very broadly. So we try to ensure the preservation of the university's history as holistically as possible. But as I'll discuss shortly, unfortunately, gaps have emerged over time. For those of you who aren't familiar with archives, I do just want to provide a really brief overview, and I'm also happy to answer any questions about this too. Archives are records of enduring value that document the human experience that may include letters, photographs, sound recordings, and they are increasingly digital records. Archivists like myself are trained to preserve, organize, and provide access to these important materials so that we can move toward a more complete historical record, and so that we can also try to explore and learn from the past. Archivists preserve documentary evidence for all of society for myriad uses, but it is important to note that different archival repositories have different collecting scopes. So, for example, the University Archives here focuses specifically on documenting the institutional memory of the University of Illinois. But if you were to go to the University Archives at the University of Minnesota, they would focus specifically on the University of Minnesota's history. And there's also special collections too that have an array of different collecting areas that they focus on. So just to give you a sense that, different archives and special collections have different focus for their collecting. To give you a sense of how you might use our records, people might visit the archives to do research in order to find a photo of what Green Street looked like in the late 1970s, or so that they can make a connection with an ancestor who was an alum of the university, or so that they can understand the process that a faculty member employed to develop a foundational idea. There are lots of uses for and reasons to use archives, and lots of reasons why records are important. With regards to the history of computing, the University Archives has records from the Department of Computer Science and units like the NCSA that document research and technological developments such as ILIAC, which was one of the first automatic electronic digital computers owned by a university, and Plato, a computer-based learning system, in addition to faculty research and also records that document the politics of those technologies. The records also document interdisciplinary research that drew on computing in a number of ways. A notable example being research in cybernetics, which was centered at the Biological Computer Laboratory, which was in existence from the 1950s through the 1970s. Now to provide some broad context for archival sources on women in computing. And I'll be starting by talking about the College of Engineering as an example, though I realize that IT and computing are distributed across campus in different administrative units and disciplinary areas. So when I first came to the university in 2012, I came across this book, which was one of the main, though not the only, histories of the U of I College of Engineering. And it was written in 1967 at the University Centennial. But needless to say, I did a double take when I saw the title of the book. The book signaled to me that I needed to look more closely at our holdings to see to what extent anyone besides men and their ideas were reflected in the records. While white men are predominantly represented, we do have materials that document underrepresented individuals and groups, such as the records of the local chapter of Society of Women Engineers. Yet at that time, the archives only had the personal papers of one woman faculty member in engineering. To a certain extent, we had more records that document underrepresented groups like women as a collective in records, rather than documented as individuals, as in faculty or alumni papers. And since that time to date, of the archive's 110 collections of faculty papers, for the College of Engineering, we only have 2, which are the personal papers of women faculty. In 2018, so just a few years ago, the book Women and Ideas came out, and it's edited by Laura D. Hahn and Angela S. Walters. And this book was also published in the context of an anniversary for the university, but it was for the university's recent sesquicentennial, which is a word that I struggled saying for a long, long time, but since I had to say it a bunch of times, I finally now can pronounce it, which is an accomplishment. But for me, this book presented an opportunity to look further to see what records the archives might have to shed light on the histories of women faculty and alumni in engineering. Research into the history of women in engineering reveals sources about women through biographical files, a few photographs, and mentions of early women graduates in the Board of Trustees reports. Information about women engineers is there, but the sources are fewer and far between than those for men engineers. One could say that the lack of archival records on women in engineering is due to their overall historical underrepresentation in these fields. Up to the mid to late 20th century, science and technology were largely considered domains of expertise for men. This gendering of scientific knowledge, production, and technical expertise precluded the involvement of women in these enterprises largely. While the last few decades have seen concerted efforts in academia and industry to be more inclusive, women continue to remain underrepresented in engineering and the sciences. Gender stereotypes and biases are cited as predominant factors contributing to women's underrepresentations in these fields. Nonetheless, many institutions, including the University of Illinois, have established initiatives and programs that seek to combat the underrepresentation of women students, staff, and faculty in engineering and the sciences. And one of these is Women at NCSA. But the underrepresentation of women scientists and engineers in society is also mirrored in the archival record. Despite a few specialized repositories and initiatives, such as the Archives of Women in Science and Engineering, which is at Iowa State University, and MIT's more recent initiative called Women at MIT, overall women in science, in the sciences and engineering have not been well documented by archival repositories. Documenting women in these spaces has been challenging given the historically fewer numbers of women in these fields. However, it's also worth noting that This is compounded by the fact that a lack of critical mass of archival materials by and about them has meant that women have not seen themselves reflected in the archival record or in archival repositories more largely. So if a goal for archivists is to create a historical record that serves as a mirror of society, this has instead resulted in archival holdings that misrepresent that reality. Despite the fact that women have been a minority in this space, they are nevertheless still there and have always been there. And this is something that the book Women in Ideas and Engineering points out. Turning to women in IT and computer science more specifically, while some mainstream histories of women in computing champion the few pioneers at the profession's inception, researchers have noted their overall underrepresentations in histories of science and technology, as well as in archival sources. So now I just want to provide a bit of context about the history of women in computing itself. And of course, this is not comprehensive by any means, but I just wanted to show a few statistics and also note a few overarching historical trends as well. So in the early decades of computing, women comprised a substantial portion of the workforce in the US and the UK. In the US, at least, by the mid-1980s, the number of women entering the computing workforce and studying computer science had begun to decline. Today, 19% of bachelor's degrees in computer science are earned by women overall, and women comprise 26% of positions in the computing industry. And in a 2016 study, women included 15% of tenure-track faculty in computer science. To provide some local statistics, here at Illinois, the Women in Engineering website notes that 30% of current computer science majors are women. So recent histories of women in computing underscore that they were pivotal figures during the rise of modern computing and to the field's trajectory and growth over the 20th century, but also their decrease over time and more recent initiatives to try to change that. To understand the latter, we have seen the emergence of scholarship that studies the marginalization of women in computing. And these histories reveal that women have always been part of the computing and information technology fields, but to understand their decline in numbers requires understanding the ways that their labor has been entrenched in the history of the gendering of technological development and technical expertise. When we look at the records that we have here in the archives to tell the story of women in computing at Illinois, we can see the presence of women, but not much about their personal experiences. Besides the recent acquisition of the personal papers of Geneva Belford, who was a professor of computer science from 1977 through 2000, much of the documentation that we have comes in the form of a few photographs that illustrate women computer operators in the 1950s and 1960s. Some of these photos contain information about these individuals, such as this photo, which depicts Caroline Brown in 1954, who was a computer teletype writer for ILLIAC. We have other photos for which we have little information, though, about who they depict, such as this photo, which is simply titled ILLIAC Input Output, with an unnamed woman from the late 1950s or the early 1960s. Or this photo of ILLIAC 1, which depicts 2 men and 1 woman to the right. We didn't know the name of the woman on the right until recently, and actually Laura D. Hahn, one of the editors of Women in Ideas and Engineering, connected me with an individual named Ramona Borders back in 2017 to do an oral history interview. And Ramona was an operator for ILLIAC 1 and also manager for the Computer Services Office for a number of years. And it was during the interview with her that I showed her a couple of photos that we had that illustrated women computer operators. And she pointed to this photo and said that that was her. So that was really exciting that we were able to identify her in that photo since we hadn't known who she was for a very long time. I recently listened to an interview with Mar Hicks, who published the book Programmed Inequality: How Britain Discarded Women Technologists and Lost Its Edge in Computing. And they noted, quote, how omnipresent in a visual sense women are in the archive, and yet how hard to find they are in the written archive. And these photos seem to suggest something similar in terms of the representation of women visually, but with little written information to provide additional context, unfortunately. And I do want to note that many of the issues that I've just discussed are not atypical of archives. We often acquire photos from campus units, and sometimes we have information about the photos, such as the years that they were taken, who is represented and what activity is taking place. But a lot of times we don't have that information, and researchers are left guessing as to some of the details about these photos. We can sometimes infer based on context what the photos depict, but lacking this information can be particularly frustrating when trying to gather information about individuals and communities who are already underrepresented in our holdings. So women were involved in early computing work at the university, not just as faculty, but as computer operators, programmers, and managers, which speaks directly to the early history of computing in which women played prominent roles. We therefore have photos in our holdings that depict women in these roles. And since computing was not solely the domain of faculty members, information technologists are an important part of that history. But they are typically documented as a collective in administrative records, or as I mentioned, singular photos with little information, rather than solely as individuals or creators of records. As an archivist, I believe it is important to contest and confront these silences in our records. At the same time, it's important to respect individuals and communities who don't want to be documented. Not everyone wants to become part of the historical record, and that is important to respect. But I do think it is important to create a dialogue and be a collaborator when and if needed. And I think it is important for archivists to consider centering collecting efforts not just on documentation about women as a collective, but as individuals. The ways in which computing became masculinized led it to center men as its main cultural and scientific actors and innovators. And who gets to decide, we should question though, who gets to decide who is an innovator and who gets to decide who does quote unquote important work, of which archival evidence should be preserved. And this might mean moving away from focusing on documenting computing as the history of the computer as a machine and artifact, which makes the labor behind those machines perhaps less visible, and tends to highlight the main innovator behind them, as opposed to the network of people who are bringing that technology into existence and maintaining it. But it also might mean that we need to be more proactive about collecting documentation. So I want to talk briefly about two different initiatives that the Archives has done and is currently doing to document women in computing and in science and engineering more broadly. In 2017, I received a grant from the Association for Computing Machinery, or the ACM History Committee, to do a pilot oral history project focused on women in IT and computer science. And this led to the recording of 6 oral history interviews in total. And in particular, I was interested in oral history as a mechanism for documenting women in this space because it is an approach that is both creator-centered and would also enable me to capture women whose papers may not have been captured in the past. Or it also might lead to the acquisition of some personal papers, which it did in at least one case, which is really great. Oral history is often used to fill and remediate gaps in archival holdings, but in many ways it is unique and important historical evidence in its own right. This is not to say that oral history should be seen as a replacement for collecting personal papers, but oral histories can help us to understand and problematize the absence of archival records and papers, as well as capture unique information that we might not easily capture otherwise. Oral history is also documentation that is co-created with the archivist, rather than collected by the archivist. So when used to create evidence about underrepresented groups, I think it can be a tool for both the archivist and the interviewee to contest these silences in the records. So when we talk about oral history as just filling the gaps, I think it is really much more than that. So oral history can enable archivists to collect a record of people who haven't been documented, not just as evidence that documents an underrepresented group, but as individualized evidence that centers the interviewee as a creator of historical evidence. In contrast, administrative records from a dean's office or an academic program can position women as a monolithic category in a lot of ways and don't bring to bear differences in identities across race, sexuality, and class. Another initiative that I want to mention is a lecture series that my colleague in the Archives, Kristen Allen Wilson, and I are doing, which is to host over the fall and spring semesters, a lecture series that's specifically focused on women in science. The Women in Science lecture series features a different speaker every month, and while not focused on computing specifically, we are trying to have speakers from a broad array of sciences. And our next talk is actually next Tuesday, November 10th, from noon to 1 p.m. and will feature Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation, Dr. Susan Martinez. And we're really grateful to the NCSA, which is one of our sponsors for this initiative. One of our goals with this lecture series is to create and preserve an archival record of women scientists' research through preserving the video recordings of the lectures, and also to create a dialogue around the importance of documenting women in this space. So if you're interested in learning more about the lecture series or registering for a future talk, you can see the link on that slide, and I'm also happy to make sure that that link makes it into the chat after my talk. So in closing, I want to say that while many people associate archives with the past, archives are very much tied to the future. Records are preserved and made accessible with future generations in mind for future purposes. When we imagine researchers in the future who wish to understand the roles that women had in computing and learn what their experiences were, they will need to consult recorded evidence. But I believe imagining the future of the historical record must be a collaborative endeavor between archivists, creators of records, and communities of stakeholders. For future women computer scientists and technologists, records can be an anchor to their experience when they see what women like them did 50, 20, or even 10 years ago. When creators of records and stakeholders and archives understand not just the utility of records, but the power that they can have on future generations, then they can imagine why records need to have a future. Through my own experience, I believe a collaborative model towards stewardship leads to our records becoming richer sources over time, when we work together to highlight, use, and preserve these records and realize that they matter now and in the future. And there is much more work that needs to be done to create an inclusive historical record of women in computing. So thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to take any questions as well as learn your thoughts. And if you're interested in either participating in an oral history interview, or if you have any suggestions for prospective interviewees, I would really appreciate any suggestions that you have. So please feel free to reach out to me. And thank you again. And also I included some of my references for this talk too, if you'd like to see those. Thanks.